giant robots smashing into other giant robots.
This is the Giant Robots Smashing into Other Giant Robots podcast, where we explore the design, development, and business of great products. I'm your host, Chad Pytel, and I'm joined today by Andy Budd, venture partner at Seed Camp and advisor to startups and senior designers. Andy, thanks so much for joining me.
I mean, look, who couldn't accept an invite from such an amazingly named podcast? I was very intrigued. So I absolutely love it. I can't wait to kind of chat to you about what we've got in store.
We do have that going for us, is the name. If nothing else, that's a draw. So, Andy, I don't think we've ever met before, but I've known about the design firm, the agency that you led for years and years and years, because thoughtbot was founded in 2003. We knew of Clearleft. We went in some of the same circles. And so I'm surprised we haven't met before. But thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you. Me too. I mean, I'm always amazed when I meet people that remember Clearleft, because obviously it feels like it was ages ago that I founded it, and we're in a different generation now. I mean, back when I founded my agency, agencies like us and Happy Cog and Adaptive Path were all the rage. Now you speak to people and, agencies are kind of a little kind of like a lot of it a figment of people's past, because everyone's now focusing on the big tech companies and the big AI companies. So it's really lovely to meet people who were around at the time when agencies ruled the roost.
Mm. So we'll come back, I think, to Clearleft in a bit, but you a while ago now, I guess 13 years ago, or thereabouts. When did you leave Clearleft?
I left Clearleft not that long ago. I left Clearleft just kind of like towards the start of the pandemic. So I ran the agency. I founded Clearleft in 2005. So actually a little bit after your agency. I ran it for about 15 years. And then around sort of 2019, we started planning my exit and becoming an employee-owned company. And then we actually became employee-owned, I think, before the pandemic hit. And originally I was going to make my announcement. I was leaving in like March, April 2020. And then obviously, this thing, bulldozer, came running through. And so I stayed there for maybe another year. And I think I left kind of either the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. But yeah, I would have been left about sort of five years now, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, let's just stay on this track, because how did you arrive at employee trust ownership as the best option for you and for Clearleft?
Well, let me back up for the people that have never heard of Clearleft, which I imagine is probably the majority of your audience. So back in sort of 2005, I founded this agency. It was just me and my two business partners, Rich and Jeremy, at the time. And we were arguably the first UX agency in the UK. There were people at the time that were doing usability testing and doing information architecture, but nobody that we were aware of at the time had kind of brought these worlds of like UX and UI together. So we were one of the first. We were inspired by an agency in the US called Adaptive Path, who some of your audience, particularly if they're American, might have heard of, who started a few years before us, and they were arguably the first UX agency of any note, at least sort of in the US. And we love what they were doing. We met the folks at various conferences like South by Southwest, and we thought we're going to sort of do something like this in the UK. And so we built this sort of agency. In the first 3 or 4 years, it was really tough going because nobody had ever heard of UX. But as this became like the dominant way of doing things, we just kind of like started to explode. And, for a while we were kind of like, regularly winning awards around like best agency in the world, basically, in terms of UX. And so a lot of this was because we wrote a lot. All the founders and all the team were very vocal. We spoke at conferences, we wrote blog posts, we wrote books. I wrote one of the first ever books on like CSS design back in the day. And so we had this kind of like brand and reputation. We always wanted to be an indie agency. Like some people start an agency because they want to be huge and they want to be millionaires and retire. We were always geeks. We were always doing it because we loved it. Like we were that kind of generation of bloggers who would like spend our evenings and weekends chatting to people and figuring out CSS tricks or figuring out like new ways of kind of doing the work. And so our goal was never to sell and become, absorbed into this big company. As actually happened with Adaptive Path. Like Adaptive Path, I'm not going to dismiss anybody's choices. They got bought by a big fintech company, Capital One, and they ended up becoming a big part of Capital One's in-house team. But 3 or 4 years later, they removed the Adaptive Path brand, and a lot of people have never heard of them now because the brand didn't carry on.
Yeah, in our business, there's really a lot of companies take private equity or are bought by private equity. Happened with Adaptive Path. It would be like a strategic acquisition, or they get bought by a larger consulting company. I think those are the three most common paths. And I don't have a lot of good examples of any companies our sizes that took one of those paths and it worked out well for the company and the people who worked there.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the key. A lot of the people I know that were the founders of those companies, it worked out pretty well. They got a couple of million, pounds, purchase. They stay in the company that acquired them for a couple of years. They leave. They go and sit on an island somewhere, kind of stroking a white cat and smoking a cigar. And at the same time, like all the work they put in terms of building a brand and building a team disappears. And a lot of the people who are left behind kind of like suddenly realize that they've been a part of building a thing, but they haven't necessarily profited. And so again, I'm not denying anyone that's, if that's the path that you want to go down, that's absolutely fine. But for us, we built a collective. The reason we were successful is not because of the genius of the founders, but because everybody that had kind of come through ClearLeft kind of worked really hard and often took massive pay cuts. These are people that could have been working in the top tech companies, but they didn't want to be, joining a Meta and spending 6 months tweaking a button, or joining Twitter and kind of optimizing a chat interface. These are people that wanted to come in and work with some of the biggest brands around, doing these 0 to 1 projects that were really exciting. And so when we were at our peak, we were working with all the kind of biggest brands in the UK, at least, maybe across Europe and even the world. And so people that came to ClearLeft, they did it not because they wanted to make a ton of money, because they wanted to really become amazing designers. They wanted to lean into the craft. And so we kind of wanted that to carry on. And so there was this risk, there was a risk that hey, someone would come along and they'd dangle a big carrot and I'd go, oh, actually, I come from a working class background. I never had any money. It would have been really easy for someone to kind of, slide a big sort of suitcase of cash over the table and go, hey, you'll be fine, but all the rest of your team aren't going to be. And look, I'd love to think that if that happened, I'd have the moral kind of ability to say no. This is generational wealth. There's a chance I would have said yes. And so one of the reasons for becoming employee owned was actually to make that really difficult. As an employee owned trust, it's now no longer just the owners, the directors, like me and the other founders, who get to decide. If someone comes and offers us a big suitcase of cash, we need to get everybody on board. And if the rest of the team say no, this is not something that we're doing, it's not going to be in the benefit of us, then the deal is nixed. And to be honest, a lot of companies that want to acquire you would look at the kind of the governance and the setup of a employee-owned company, and it wouldn't be attractive to them. So also it was almost you could argue if you were a diehard capitalist, we shot ourselves in the foot because we made it really difficult to acquire us. But that was a strategic decision because we wanted the brand to carry on, even though I wasn't going to be there. I love the idea that there'd be a next generation of people taking the company over, maybe a third or fourth generation. Maybe this company would be around for not just 15 years, but 30, 40, 50 years. And so we wanted to make that possibility as real as possible. And I think a lot of agencies, they live and die on their founders. And when their founders get bored or they get old and retire, the whole company disappears. And that was something I didn't want to do. The company was never worth a lot of money, but I'd put my blood, sweat, and tears into building the brand. And I wanted the brand, that was my legacy, really. I wanted the legacy to live on far beyond my level of interest or involvement. And so that was kind of one of the main reasons. The other reason was that we just wanted the team to kind of be in control. Like, as I said, the team were the ones that made the company what it became. We always had a kind of a philosophy, like, people would come and offer us work. And if the team didn't want to work with them, we wouldn't make them. Like, we had a couple of big banks. We had one big bank in the UK. It would have given us tons of money. But one of our staff members was like, this bank made my family homeless like 20 years ago when they kind of foreclosed on my dad's business, and I could never possibly work with them. And like, well, that's fine, of course. We're not going to force you to work for this company that kind of ruined your life. And what kind of company would we be, and what kind of boss would we be if we kind of like made that decision? So we always kind of taking our team's views into mind, and so just making that formal seem sensible.
Well, you've articulated very well everything that is motivating me as well. And so we are just announcing that thoughtbot is also moving into a trust model.
Oh, wow.
A little bit of a different trust model. Instead of employee trust, specifically, it is a purpose trust. And so with a purpose trust, you set up a purpose, and it can be the employees, but it can also be like Patagonia did it with the environment. And so Patagonia is a big company in the US that has moved to a perpetual purpose trust ownership. And for us, it actually is a sort of a preservation of what thoughtbot is today. And that involves not only the employees and remaining an independent company, but the contributions that we make to open source and to the community that we have. So actually, on our trust committee will be a community seat as well, both an employee seat and a member of the community, probably open source community or something like that.
I mean, that's really, really cool. That's really, really good to hear. I mean, the employee ownership trust model is a particular kind of quirk of kind of UK law. It's something that the government brought in because they wanted to see more purposeful companies that would give back to their employees. But I'm sure there's, around the world, there's going to be lots of different models. Obviously, Patagonia are a big one and really sort of well looked up to. And obviously, sort of, there's lots of kind of like, B Corp companies as well that have a similar, even though the ownership maybe is still more traditional, the purpose is kind of baked into their, in the UK, we call it articles of association, the way the rules that the company runs. And that's all stuff that we had to do as well. Like, we had to write a specific, even though our company isn't the same structure as being purposeful, the founders had to write letters of wishes. And the letter of wishes was basically like, hey, this is why we built the company. These are the things we value. And we are hoping, we can't force you, but we are hoping that as you now take this company forward, you will listen to those values and understand them and carry them on, because that's what made us great. And that's what we think, will help us go into the next generation. And so I think that baking purpose into the governance layer of a company is really, really useful.
Yeah. I actually looked at a few different models of direct employee ownership. And for us, it was complicated because we're fully remote. We have a whole bunch of people in the US and have a US entity. And then we have a whole bunch of people in the UK and have a UK entity. But we also have people in Brazil and Mexico and Spain and Portugal and Germany, France, having an actual structure that could make everyone work. So the Purpose Trust is an actual entity in the US, and it holds the shares of thoughtbot, but then everyone can share in the success.
I mean, that's it for me. It was the everyone sharing in the success. The way it works in the UK ultimately, because trusts are a little bit weird, and I think trusts sometimes have a bad reputation. You hear about all these really, really rich people that put money in trust for their families as a way of avoiding tax, and that's not why we did it. Like, basically, we still want to have a company that runs like a normal company. We want to have a board. We want to have kind of an MD. What we didn't want to do is we didn't want to be like a collective. Like, there's nothing wrong with collectives or co-ops. Like, there are lots of co-ops around the world that work really well. But I did a bit of research, and a lot of the challenges that happen with co-ops is if everyone has a voice and everyone has a vote, that also creates a lot of politics, and like I've got a local kind of co-op that I buy my fruit and veg from, but apparently they've got like 50 or 60 co-op members, and every one of their board meetings goes on for hours and hours, and is actually quite sort of fractious because trying to get 50 people to agree on a thing is really difficult. And so the way that the trusts work in the UK is basically every couple of years the company will effectively run an election, and they will elect 3 trustees. And they will then be put on the board. And then it's their job effectively to decide, to some extent, steer how the company is run ethically. We still have a managing director. And their job is the trust hires a managing director, and it's their job to run the company. But the value of the trust is they get to decide what happens with the profit. So, this is all stuff that I thought about when I was starting the trust. We have a problem of people getting on the housing ladder in the UK. So what if the trust decides, well, we'll put a fund together to make it easy for our younger employees to get their deposit for their house? That would be amazing. What if, a lot of the people that work at Clear Left have got families, and actually traveling and going on holiday is expensive? What if we bought a holiday home in France and let everybody in the company kind of use this holiday home? There are lots of things you can do beyond just giving everyone a bonus or giving everyone a dividend. And so our hope is that the company, as it grows and makes more money, they are sitting on an increasing pot of money that they can kind of do really cool things with. Maybe they give back to the community somehow. Maybe they run a bursary or a scholarship, or who knows. And that's the great thing about being a trustee, is you get to decide. So that's why we did it, partly.
Yeah. Now, you did this with the intention of it was part of your exit plan.
Well, actually, sort of yes and sort of no. I had always wanted the company to be a trust, since I first discovered the idea, maybe sort of 10 years previously. So it wasn't that we set it up as a trust so I could leave, but it just so happened that me deciding to leave was a good catalyst to go, well, this would be the perfect opportunity to have a change in governance, because if the leadership team are going and a new leadership team are forming, this would be a great time to do it. So it was definitely helpful that they happened at the same time, but I think I would have done it anyway. So yeah.
Oh, okay. And are you? So does that mean, are you still involved in any way? Are you a trustee, or are you just?
Yes. So for the first sort of 3 or 4 years, I was still a board member of Clear Left, the agency. And then the trust basically is a separate company that owns the agency. And I've retained my board seat on the trust. And so again, it's sort of fairly kind of casual. We might have a board meeting every kind of 6 months or whatever. And like I say, mostly it's kind of to decide how profit gets divided, or, if there's anything that, I guess I'm kind of like hopefully the wise old kind of uncle now. I don't run the company. I don't have a day-to-day involvement. But because I know the space reasonably well, if anyone wants to come and say, look, Andy, we're struggling with thing, what do you think? I'm happy to come and help people think through the problem. But it's the employees' company now, and I'm kind of I have the opportunity to be a backseat driver, but I don't want to be. So I kind of want to be invited in. But the last thing I wanted actually is when I left to kind of be looking over everyone's shoulders going, oh, you're doing it wrong, because it needs the new people running it needed to take over. But I'm there to help wherever I can.
Yeah. I don't have any immediate plans to leave. So this is something that we would do regardless as well. But at the same time, it's going to happen eventually. We have to be honest about that. And one of the things I really like about this structure, and it sounds like you have it too, the trust structure, is that there's a natural path to that happening that is sort of laid out for everybody. You've got the trustee seats, and with a purpose trust, you actually have a third role, and maybe you have this with an employee ownership trust as well, but it's called the trust enforcer. So it's someone that if there's a dispute among all the people involved, there's actually another person who's the trust enforcer to resolve the disputes.
We don't have that. I don't think it's a thing in the UK. It sounds very It sounds very kind of superhero, like, oh, we've got to call in the trust enforcer. But I can kind of imagine if there is a kind of a deadlock. I mean, I think the way it still works with us is kind of like a board and it's a voting thing. And I think as the kind of like the grandfathered in kind of like sellers, I think we have some sort of veto power. But I think it's still a kind of like a board vote, and so I think it's very unlikely that there'll be a deadlock at the moment. But I kind of like the trust sort of enforcer role.
And it's not even so because so you need to have this role as part of the governance structure, and I think part of it is because it's the purpose of the trust is to pursue to ensure the purpose that was laid out. You can get in a scenario where people at the company or someone says the stewardship committee that they're off track, or someone's off track for the purpose. Who's going to resolve this? And that's where that role comes in.
Just another thing I just thought of as well, just in terms of kind of like when this stuff happens and maybe why we chose this route. I think there's another thing, which is another common way that founders of agencies kind of leave and bring the next generation on board is through an employer sort of management buyout. I've actually seen quite a few agencies that do that. Like I've got a few of my friends in Brighton actually that have done that. Like they've had like the next generation of design or engineering leaders or whatever, people that have kind of like have been with the company for a while, and now they're kind of, they're almost on the board, they're driving things forward. And so the logic is, well, like, why don't I sell my shares to these people and these people effectively take over? And I love that idea as well. I love the fact that we could find that next generation of leaders. The problem we found is like, none of the people that we were working with would have had the money or been willing to risk like the homes. Basically, you'd probably have to go and get a loan and go, oh, we get a loan on our house, and that's really risky. And so while a few of my friends did this, I just didn't think it, like, if you happen to be incredibly wealthy and your team are incredibly wealthy, great. But for us, there was just no logical way that we could hand over ownership unless it was through this sort of trust mechanism. And also, again, for your audience might not realize, like, even like, this is our naivety. In the early days, we just wanted to gift shares to people. Like, hey, look, we like you. You're an amazing kind of like partner. Why don't you just have some shares? And then we realized that was basically giving people a whole chunk of tax burden, because if we give them something that actually doesn't have a real value, but maybe on paper looks like it's worth $1 million, they actually have to pay $1 million worth on the tax of kind of, tax. They might have to pay 100 or 200, K national gain, personal gains. And so, and then there are other things around kind of like, shares and sort of equity vesting periods and all that kind of stuff, but it never was going to be enough. And so we just found that the OT was kind of the cleanest way to kind of do that.
Yeah, similar here. And then also I said, well, even if we navigate that and we somehow figure that out, then we're just setting up the company to be in the same spot again at some point in the future. So why not seize this opportunity in front of us to at least try to make it so that the company can succeed on its own perpetually, potentially forever. Well, that's exciting. So it's been a few years now. How has it panned out the way you were hoping?
Well, I mean, yes and no. The company's still going. That's amazing. There's apart from like one or two people who were like long-term employees, there's a whole bunch of new people there, which is really great. So the company is kind of evolving. Interestingly, a couple of people who are now on the board of trustees were actually interns like 10 or 15 years ago that then went off and did a bunch of other things and came back. So I think that's really great. Like, we're obviously doing something well enough that people have a real fond memory for the company. And even people who have kind of left and aren't back in the company, like, have a lot of kind of love and time for Clay Left. So I think we've built a really good brand. I'm not going to lie to you that the last 5 years have been like, a bed of roses for the agency world. Right. I think the pandemic was good for some, but it was quite challenging for others. We kind of sat in the middle. Like, we didn't kind of explode. Also, we didn't kind of like disappear. I mean, so many of my agency friends kind of, the pandemic killed them. But we
through
were
both
sort of relatively
economics and also burnout. I know a bunch of people who just barely made it through that period because it was so hard. They threw themselves into it, and even though the company survived, they didn't. Like they were done after that.
It was tough. It was incredibly stressful, and I think I mean, on one level, like I'm glad I left when I did, because I think having to kind of do the next, because the weird thing is, like, the pandemic itself, like the first 18 months or whatever was a problem to be solved, and it was kind of almost a logistic problem. We're going to work from home, yada yada yada, and we managed to do that fine. But then what happened is, I think there was like a double whammy, because when everyone was working from home, everyone was like massively hiring. We were in the design space, and so suddenly, like, design hiring spiked up. All of our clients that started hiring and building out their internal teams. And so now, not only do we have the pandemic, but we are not competing against other agencies, we're competing against our own clients, which is really tough. And all of these design leaders that are come in-house, like, actually hiring an agency can often be seen, I don't think it's true, but it can be seen as a admission of guilt. Like, that you're not doing a good enough job as a leader of your discipline. You need to go and be rescued by this agency. And so for 3 or 4 years, like, it was a little bit crunchy, because like a lot of this stuff had been taken in-house. Then what happened, again, like, this is my reading on it, like,
well, you're spot on so far, in my opinion. And it's going to be, if I think you're going if you're going where I think you're going, it's going to be one thing after another, which leads us to the last 5 years have been pretty rough for the agency world.
Well, absolutely. The two other things I'm going to add, I don't know if they are the same thing, but the next thing I was going to add, which is probably not what you were expecting, but what did happen a little bit, is that because there was lots of rounds of there was a lot of hiring, there was lots of rounds of redundancy, and the people that weren't made redundant kind of stayed in the company. But often those people, like in our client businesses, were not happy there. They were kind of just grinding through. And so you saw this kind of weird, like, spike of productivity at the start of the pandemic, and then it sort of dipped down. And because there wasn't this churn of new sort of ideas, we sort of found a little bit more of a kind of a positive uptick, which is like towards the end of that, like, the teams were not pushing things forward, new projects were coming along, and they were getting sort of stuck. There was a little bit of an uptick, or we need to get some fresh blood in. And if our hiring headcount has been cancelled, maybe we do need to go and get some agency work. So there's a little bit of that. But then I think probably what you're referring to is the world of AI has kind of exploded. And I have no idea where that's going to go. I mean, I'm really excited about it. I'm actually running a conference in Brighton on the 25th of September called Design Plus AI, all about how AI is revolutionizing the kind of like the design kind of process. But a lot of agencies are, there are some agencies that are incredibly gung-ho around this, and there are a lot of agencies that are a little bit resistant to it. And so I think we're going to see another kind of interesting kind of time where the agencies that are resistant will still find work, but they'll find work in more traditional companies, traditional banks, charities, museums, university sectors, because those companies want to do the traditional kind of like old school UX role. But the more kind of exciting startup-y companies, they don't want to hire big UX now. They want to hire like a small, design or engineering team of one who can vibe code or AI develop their next product. And so I am seeing a bit of a bifurcation. I'm seeing, which hasn't happened for a while, but I'm seeing kind of people leaning into tradition and maybe younger startups leaning into like, hey, we are now shipping using AI stuff that would have taken your old agency 3 or 4 months, and we're doing it in 2 weeks. And so that's a lot more pressure. And so either you've got to kind of like jump on board, or you've got to go to the places where they value that tradition and that craft and the kind of the classic way of doing things. And so I suspect that is going to be the problem that Clear Left is going to be facing, and every other agency out there over the next kind of 18 months. And that's why I'm running a conference about it, because I want people to kind of start exploring this space and realizing which side of the fence they're going to land. And if they're going to land on the AI side, then you want to have them have all the skills they need to kind of do it and do it well. And there's a whole bunch of ethical questions around that as well, which we can or can't get into. But I think ethics or whatever aside, AI is massively changing the way we deliver design and engineering work now and for the next 3 or 4 years.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I'm curious, how are you incorporating it? How are you incorporating or counseling people to incorporate it into their design work?
Well, I am sort of somewhat lucky in that even though I sort of self-identify to some extent as a designer, a design
Yeah.
leader, I actually haven't really designed in anger for many, many years. Like, I mean, this is showing my age, but I was very much like an old school kind of Photoshop fireworks kind of person. I did a little bit of sketch, but I kind of like was kind of managing predominantly when Figma came out. And so I've worked in Figma. I've reviewed documents in Figma. I've done little bits of work in Figma, but I'm no way a kind of a Figma expert. And so the actual kind of change in the processes doesn't really affect me because I'm not shipping design work. What is interesting with AI is it's allowing me to do stuff now that doesn't require a high level of tool use. And so I can still use my kind of creative direction. I can still use my kind of eye to produce stuff that doesn't require me to spend a week, figuring out the kerning or moving things around by a couple of pixels or whatever. So, and as somebody who has become a manager, managers, particularly company leaders, are impatient by nature. Like when I was a designer, I used to love just going down a design hole and being there for weeks and weeks and weeks and not having to come up and speak to anybody. And that was really great. As I moved into kind of company leadership, like the tenor of leadership is constantly putting out fires and solving problems. And so I think my patience for kind of like deep dive design work is gone. So I love to kind of reduce the gap between an idea and getting some kind of physical manifestation. And so I think AI has allowed me to do that more than I would have done if the thing that was mediating it was a design tool. But obviously there's lots of designers that love that kind of liminal space, the kind of like the kind of the flow state that design tools give you. And the same for people, working in IDEs, engineers or whatever. Realistically, what I do now mostly is hop on calls and talk to people. And so, like how do I use AI? Well, I love Granola. It's a great note-taking tool. Sam Stevenson is the founder of Granola. It's like a unicorn in the UK. I don't know if it's really making a dent where you are at the moment. It's a lovely tool. Granola's great. So I use that for all my note-taking summarization. Because I was kind of like an early user, and because I'm not a coder, I ended up being more of an open AI kind of chat GPT kind of person than an Anthropic Claude person. I use chat GPT like I used to use Google. I am in it all the time. I find it incredibly useful as a thought partner. I found it great as an editor. I find it really good if I'm trying to like figure stuff out and want to have a sparring partner. I think when I started doing that, like 18 months ago, I was very, very conscious of the quality of the answers because there was a lot of hallucination. I think there still is levels of hallucination. But I think if you understand a space particularly well, like you can be quite good at spotting that. And to be honest, like I'm not seeing an awful lot of stuff that I think is massively wrong. If you ask it how many L's there are in yellow or pineapple or whatever, how many P's in pineapple, it will get it wrong. But weirdly, I use it for all kinds of things. I use it for filling in government forms, and I'll just point the URL and say, "Hey, look, I need to fill in this form," and it's usually pretty accurate. And so, it's become a bit of a PA. It's become a kind of a psychic, and so I use that. I do a little bit of it of prepping for my coaching sessions. Like I might feed in the last week notes and tell the AI what I'm trying to achieve, and it might kind of help guide me. One of the really interesting things is, I mean, I do, as you said on the start, like 2 days a week I do advising and investing. So 2 days a week I do investing for CCAM, and 2 days a week I do advising and coaching for private clients. And first of all, I started having private clients come to me because they found me on ChatGPT, which is great. So it's probably not called SEO, but whatever the LLM SEO equivalent.
I think it's GEO.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, my GEO is pretty good at the moment. But also what I found is this really weird kind of like multimodal thing. Whereas I've had a couple of my coaching clients, particularly I'm thinking like a designer recently. I had a senior designer, design leader, kind of actually a design kind of entrepreneur. And he was struggling with direction, what to do next. And so we had a bunch of coaching sessions. But what we'd do is like we'd talk about stuff in the session. I would give him exercises to do to help him think through some of the challenges. But then, not from my prompting, he would feed the output of those exercises into Claude or ChatGPT or whatever. And then he would come back to me in the next session and say, oh, look, been having another conversation async with my AI, and it's helped me figure out this and this and this, and I want to run it past you. Mm-hmm. And so that was really weird because, like, arguably, he could have done that all himself without having me involved. But actually, I was a useful prompt. He really valued having a human opinion. And really, the AI was basically kind of pulling together some of the threads in a way that I had identified. But it was probably easier socially, the social contract, for an AI to tell him, you're avoiding this or you're avoiding that, than someone you're paying money to who you're saying it, but you're saying it in a more subtle way. And so that was really fun how I think, almost like assistive technology, like AI is going to take people's jobs, but we are in this space where it is almost like an exoskeleton. Like you can put it on, like almost like in Aliens, like, and it gives you these superpowers. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking away a role like Ripley in Aliens. Like it just allows you to pick up much heavier boxes and move them around. So like, I think it is a really, really fun time to be here. I've got no idea where things are heading. I think it is quite scary. But I think, while we're in this emerging space, like, lean in and explore and play. Because
I think there's one, at least designers at thoughtbot there's a area of big tension, which is design is seen as a creative endeavor. So not only is it fulfilling to them to do it, but it is seen that there is creativity in coming up with something great.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between like getting your ideas out faster and never having those ideas in the first place and just letting the tool create the design from the beginning.
Yeah. And some of
and
this,
not
I
only
think,
is that the concern that, okay, well, I'm removing the part that I enjoy, but also what does that mean for our craft long term? Because if the tools you're just going to the mean, like nothing new will ever be created because they're all just generating off of what they were trained off of.
It's difficult. Look, a lot of designers get into this because they love creativity. They were the kind of like doing the art kind of classes at school, and they didn't want to get into architecture, but design was a great kind of avenue, and it pays really well. And so being able to get paid for something you love, it's that whole ikigai, isn't it? Kind of like finding something that pays you money that you love to do. It's brilliant. And I honestly think we had a brilliant kind of 15 or 20 years. I think the time between 2005 and 2015 was amazing. I think from 2015 to 2025, I do think design has gone from being this sort of artisanal thing into this industrial thing. Not everywhere. I think there are still loads of agencies that do amazing 0 to 1 work. But I do think a lot of the fundamental problems have been solved. And so when you go and work for a big tech company, when you go and work for a bank or like a Monzo or like a Google or whatever, there were very few teams that are actually doing the really lovely creative 0 to 1 stuff. Like I remember chatting to the head of design for a Google homepage, excluding Google Doodle. And I'm like, what is that? That's a search box. That's a I'm feeling lucky button. And that's some links at the bottom. And they had a 50-person design team.
Wow.
And I was like, what do you do all day? And he was trying to convince me that there was loads of stuff. Well, obviously you've got mobile, you've got Android, you've got desktop boxes, but they're all basically combinations of a search box and a button and, type ahead. And so, how much creativity is there in nudging the metrics of the Google homepage forward? Probably not a lot. It's not kind of Leonardo da Vinci levels of creativity. It's probably really, really small. And so I do think that there's this weird differentiation between what we were taught at design school or art school and what some of us oldies experienced 10 or 15 years ago versus what the reality of 90% of designers' lives are like is not this lovely creative playground. What's happened now is most designers, they are excluded from the workshops and the research and the meetings. A product manager will be in all those meetings with the stakeholders. They will turn that into PRD. You get given this 2-page PRD, which you have no context about where it comes from or what the research is or whether this idea is any good. And you are told to basically paint by numbers. Now, a lot of people find painting by numbers very therapeutic, and a lot of people would say it's incredibly creative. Sure, I can't draw the lines, but I can choose whether my cat is like brown or maybe I'll make it purple or yellow. Like there's still a level of flexibility. But I would argue that like most design now is painting by numbers, and painting by numbers has the veneer of creativity because we're in this kind of like, commercial realm. And the way I describe this, going back to your craft thing, like this might be a little bit convoluted, but 200 years ago in my hometown, if I wanted a chair, I would save up for 6 months worth of salary. I would go to the local carpenter and they would make me a handcrafted chair. And they would be having a ball, like they'd be picking the wood and, they'd spend weeks and weeks and weeks building this thing. But because it was so labor intensive, it cost me a load of money. So if you go around to lots of old, royal palaces in the UK and old stately homes, they have like 4 chairs because only the rich people could afford chairs. And even then, it was really expensive. And so what's happened in the world of carpentry is we had Habitat and then we had IKEA. And in IKEA, you don't have a carpenter in every town getting sent a description of the chair from IKEA and then you crafting it from scratch. You have 3 or 4 designers, probably hired on contract, that we paid £2,000 to design a bookcase, and then you send it to a CNC cutting shop that cuts things. And I would argue a lot of design should be the designers who are designing the chair. I think a lot of design, basically Figma operators, are like the people that are cutting the CNC models and actually, shipping it to customers. Now, is that good for craft? Absolutely not. The quality of carpentry, I'd say, on the whole, has kind of dipped. Is that good for consumers? Hell yes. Because I've been able to buy lots of beautifully designed, cheap furniture over the years. When I'm done with it, I can pass it on to the next person. So the quality of craft has come down. Now, does that mean that carpentry is destroyed entirely? No. Every town or city will probably still have some bespoke cabinet maker. But they're now not designing chairs. They're designing some rich person's kind of like media room or their bespoke sort of wine storage cabinet or whatever. So there's still craft going on there, but it's now many, many fewer people doing probably better work, but for very, very small number of incredibly wealthy people. And I think that's where we're heading now. I think agencies and design in general, the 0 to 1 stuff, there'll still be work. There'll just be few of us, and we'll be doing the equivalent of designing someone's kitchen from scratch. And most people will just be buying a kitchen that's designed by IKEA off the shelf, and that's absolutely fine. But does that mean we've hit peak designer? I think it does. I've always basically said that I think we hit peak designer, the maximum designers there will ever need to be, probably in 2020, 2021, in that hiring boom. And then every year since, there's been cuts and cuts and cuts. And I think the number of designers that are needed are going down and down and down. Now, what I don't know is whether the peak will sort of flatten out at 95% of the total, or 90, or 85, or will it go down to 60, 50, 40, 30? I have no idea what that peak is. I do not believe we will not need designers. I think the question is is it 95%? Is it 50%? Is it 20%? Who knows?
So at the risk of starting another topic on a segue, so you're advising and investing in startups now. How does this factor into that? What do the startups that are getting started today look like and need, and how do they approach things?
Yeah. So I got into investing about 5 years ago. So as you said, I work for Seedcamp, which is one of the top probably 3 VC funds for pre-seed and seed stage sort of investing in Europe. So really, really good brand. And one of the reasons I got into it actually was because, if you don't mind, I'm going to do a sidetrack and I'll come back to the main, because I think this is interesting. As I said, for 2 or 3 days a week, I coach design leaders. And one of the problems that most design leaders come to me is Andy, I really care about design, but my boss doesn't care about design. How can I make them care about design? And so a lot of my coaching is helping those people raise the value of design in organizations. But my thinking was, well, what if these designers didn't have to convince the founder? What if the founder was bought in from day one? And what's the best way to get them buy-in from day one? What if we invest in day one? So I became a VC because I wanted to get those founders who maybe never spoken to a designer before to realize how much value designers are in the early stages, how great they are at helping you think through your ideas, because your ideas are kind of this weird fuzzy, if you're not a designer, like they're either manifested in code or they're manifested in bad drawings. So what if we mash a designer next to the founder, and that can almost be like their kind of AI agent, kind of like, like helping them think through things. And also go to market. I think designers are great at go to market. Like we understand what works. And if something isn't working, we don't just like throw things at the wall. We kind of use a scientific method. We talk to them, we do research, we understand. And we're really good at empathizing with users. Like a lot of founders, they're experts, so they can't think like a beginner. And designers are great at thinking like a beginner. And a lot of the problems I think founders have is they just don't understand what it's like to use their product for the first time. And so designers are great at all those things. And so, like I say, my thinking was, hey, if I start on the journey, if I, in the agency world, a founder would come to me and say, hey, look, what should we do? And I'd say, well, you should do X and it would cost you 200K. And then think, well, is Andy telling me this because I really need to spend 200K? Or is he telling me this because he wants to make a ton of money and he's taking me for a ride? Now what happens is the table's reversed. Like a founder will say, hey, look, Andy, what should I do here? And I've already given them a ton of money. And so now they're not thinking that I'm trying to take their money. They know that the advice I'm giving them is because I've invested in them and I want the best for them. And so our goals are aligned. And so when I say to them, hey, look, you should consider doing some research or hiring a designer or whatever, they're much more likely to listen. And so my goal with becoming an investor is I want to build a generation of founders who understand design enough that when they hire their founding designer, that founding designer doesn't have to convince them because they're already bought in. When they hire their first designer, their 10th designer, their 100th designer, there's none of this kind of like, I need to convince my boss that this is important, because the success of the company has been because of that. So that's why I got into VC in the first place. Now, with that in mind, I thought that pretty much every conversation I had with the founder would be, they would show me a really badly designed idea. And the first thing I say is, oh, you've got to hire my friend, whomever, and they'll help you think it through. And I was really shocked and vaguely annoyed that wasn't the case. Every founder that was coming to me that had built a product, the design was pretty good. And when I asked them, like, who designed this? Like, what, do you have a designer? They're like, no, we don't have a designer. We have a bunch of engineers that are using a UI kit. And sure, if you look under the hood, you can tell that it's a UI kit. But if you're like just trying to get something out the door, do you need to go to the local carpentry company and buy a bespoke kitchen? Or if this is your first kind of like home, is an IKEA kitchen enough? It's probably enough. And so actually, I stopped even bothering trying to convince people to hire a designer straight out of the gate. What I tended to find, like the IKEA kitchen, is once you've lived with it for a while, the gaps maybe start to show. And so often people would come back to me a year and a half later and go, look, now we've got as far as we can do with this kind of template. I now need your help to find a designer and help push this forward. So that's great. What switched recently is that rather than the founders having to rely on a UI kit and an engineer, that all comes bundled in with AI. And rather than it taking them 6 months to build the prototype, it's taking them 6 weeks. And so I'm seeing people come to me with really credible looking products that a year ago I would have thought would have taken 6 or 9 months. And it turns out it's taken 6 weeks. And they've done it all without a designer. Now, the criticisms will actually be true. Like, there's a lot of gradients there. There's a lot of kind of like dark mode, there's a lot of kind of like really obvious tropes that come from these tools. But I've seen a lot of that just hiring a mediocre designer. Like the average designer in the UK, and I'm sure the average designer in America and Canada and wherever, also produces mediocre work. And so you can't look at one of the best designers in the world and compare that with the average output that AI delivers. But what you can do is you can say this person doesn't know any designers. They're probably going to hire someone that's really crap and has AI produce something that's either as good as the mediocre designer in a shorter space of time or better than the mediocre designer. And that is often the case. And again, what tends to happen is a year in, their AI designed product starts to creak and doesn't quite work, and they bring in a design team to kind of build it. And actually, I went to an event in San Francisco, I guess 6 weeks ago. It was an invite-only event from Jeff Veen, who's one of the founders of Adaptive Path back in the day. He's also a design VC now. And he invited design leaders from all of the big kind of tech companies, Anthropic, OpenAI, kind of Figma. And the interesting thing is, if you believe the hype, you'd imagine that all of these companies would be firing designers left, right, and center, but they're hiring them. Because this new capability means that you actually do need a bunch more designers. Now, that's not going to be true of everybody, but the people that are creating the tools see the value in design. And so we're in this weird space. Some companies are scaling up, some companies are scaling down, some companies are leaning in, some companies are leaning out. I have no idea where it's going to go, but I do know that it's really, really exciting. And to put the cherry on the cake with your question, it's empowering more and more people than ever to be entrepreneurs, particularly designers. Like, there was a time when if you were a designer and you wanted to start your own business, you had to find a CTO. And most of the CTOs that they knew were on $500K a year, and no way were they going to leave working in their big bank to come and do some rubbishy startup that has no guarantee of working. Whereas now, I know so many designers who have not only designed their product, but they've shipped it and it's gone live thanks to AI. And so, sure, AI might be taking some design jobs and putting it in the hands of engineers or product managers, but it's also empowering designers to ship product in a way that is quite outstanding.
And as you said, designers are really good at research and talking with customers and finding that product market fit as well. Like, they've got a skill set. So being able to leverage that and then empower into self-delivery of stuff is puts you in a really strong position.
Yep. There's no blockers. There's no kind of, I don't have enough money to hire somebody. The gap between idea and it being live on a server somewhere has shrunk. Now, this has unintended consequences. A couple of years, at the start of the kind of like the web revolution in kind of the .com boom, you needed millions of pounds to get a company off the ground just to buy server space. And then obviously Amazon Cloud and whatever kind of destroyed that. A year, 18 months ago, you still needed maybe like 3 or 4 engineers in 6 months. Now that's come down even further. So now we've got loads of designers who can ship things, but we've got loads of everybody that can ship things. And so I would say that there are more and more people coming onto the market that have ideas. So that's making it harder, I think, for VCs, because now, we're seeing maybe 10x the number of companies pop up than there would have been a few years ago, which is harder to kind of sort through. Also, interestingly, though, those companies need less money. Right. So the VC model might be starting to kind of show signs of age, because it used to be that you might needed to give them $1 million to get the first version of the product. Now they've vibe coded the first version of the product. And so really the money is now going, arguably, not into product, but into go-to-market. I mean, that's why, I don't know if you can see on my shoulder, my book, The Growth Equation. It's all about kind of the growth stuff, because actually we figured out how to make great product. But with so much product out there, how do we sell it? How do we find customers? How do we find our first 100 users, our first 1,000 users, our first 10,000 users? That's where all the money's going to now. It's going to not building great product, but finding customers. And one of the things I'm finding when I'm investing is, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was looking for an amazing technical founder or maybe an amazing design founder. I'm now looking for people that can sell, because there are so many amazing products that just sat on the shelves not being used because the founder can't get people to care. And so things like marketing, things like sales, things like positioning are becoming much more important in a world where the gap to shipping something is no longer the limiting factor, but it's getting people to give a hoot.
Well, Andy, thank you for stopping by and sharing wisdom with us. And it was great to chat about, this trust ownership structure that we both find ourselves in as well. If folks want to, we're going to link everything in the show notes, but if folks want to get in touch with you or follow along for you, where are the best places for them to do that?
Absolutely. So if you're a Medium user, you can search for the Design VC where I post about all my VC stuff, or the Design Coach, where I post about all of my design coaching work. All of that is also cross-posted on my website, andybudd.com, but people tend to remember Medium better. You can subscribe and follow me on Medium. Or I guess the social media platform that I'm mostly using at the moment is either Blue Sky or LinkedIn. So follow me there if you want to kind of see everything I'm up to.
Awesome. And we are both going to be in Brighton at the end of the month, I believe, for Evolve.
Yes. That's a really...
What'd you say?
I was just saying, it's a really fun conference. It's a local conference looking at the local tech scene.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward. I think it's happening in about 2 weeks' time, so very, very close. And I'm going to be talking about two things. I'm going to be talking about, I think I'm doing two separate panel conversations. One is about the future of AI and jobs, which we've touched on now. And one is around investing and how AI is changing the investing landscape, which is also something we touched on. So you've got a little bit of an insight into some of the thoughts that might come out at that conference.
Yeah. And as we talked about, I guess it was last week, thoughtbot is running sort of a social mixer the day before that. And the link to that to register will be in the show notes. We've got a couple spots left, but we've got plenty of room because we have the terrace that we can flow onto too. So if you're in the area or attending that conference, take a look at those show notes to get that link. Andy, once again, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Brilliant, amazing. The last thing I was going to say, obviously, you jogged my memory in terms of conferences, is I mentioned that I'm running this Design Plus AI conference. It's called designplusAIsummit.com. That happens on the 25th of September. And if your audience are interested in that intersection between design and AI and how it's going to be changing their world, I'd love them to come along. We've got amazing speakers like Randy Hunt, VP or head of design at Notion. We've got folks from I like Cameron Moll, who is a classic. You might remember Cameron from back in the day, an amazing designer. We've got loads of really cool people coming along to talk about how they're using AI. So it should be really good fun.
Awesome. Is that online or
it's nice? A real in-person conference. It's taking place at the Dome.
Conference.
Yeah. a genuine bona fide in-person conference is at the Dome in Brighton. We're doing a leadership day the day before, which is invite only for kind of like heads of design. And then we're doing a 500 person conference the following day on the 25th, which will be open to everybody. And it should be a lot of fun.
Okay, great. That'll be linked in the notes as well. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for listening and watching. This podcast is brought to you by thoughtbot. You can find me at cpytel@thoughtbot.social, and we'll see you next time.